everyone, I'm FARIHAH. So today in this video, I will explain in details about the introduction of Spratly Island, the South China Sea, where the Spratly Islands are located at the South China Sea, which has valuable assets and consists of a number of small islands, atolls, rocks and reefs. It is adequately known as the East in Vietnam and West Philippine Sea. The conflict of Spratly Islands arose when many countries claimed the right towards the territory and sovereignty over ocean areas. The disputes involved the 6 nations, which are Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, including China. The tension between rivals has been protracted for many than 50 years. As we move ahead, the issue for this topic is strategically shipping routes. The Spratly Islands kept many eyes and attention, especially from superpower nations, because of the positive contribution towards the economic growth of world merchant shipping passing through the island. The second issue is oil and gas potential of the Spratly Islands. From the geographical perspective, the oil specialists had high expectations because the structure of Spratly was very promising for the exploration of oil and gas. The question is, why it happened? Multiple nations claimed sovereignty over the South China Sea's Spratly Island. French Indochina claimed the island in the early 20th century, starting with a dispute. The Republic of China, ROC, occupied the island after World War II. ROC maps from 1947 included the Spratly Islands. Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia claimed the island in the 1970s. China claimed the islands, claiming ancient sovereignty. Dozens of Vietnamese sailors died in the 1988 naval dispute over the Spratly Islands between China and Vietnam. Economic benefits all the Spratly Island issue. The islands are rich in oil and natural gas, and the surrounding waterways are major fishing grounds. The islands are strategically placed in the South China Sea, a significant international trading route. For the conflict over the Spratly Island territorial dispute in the South China Sea involved China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. The issue involves ownership and control of a series of South China Sea islands, reefs, and atolls thought to be rich in oil and natural gas reserves and vital fishing grounds. China claims the majority of the Spratly Islands based on historical evidence and its 9-line map, extending its territorial claims for beyond its shoreline. However, several countries in the area claim sections of the island, and there have been many incidences of tension and conflict over the years, including military standoff, territorial attacks, and fishing boat conflicts. The conflict might disrupt the region and endanger international trade. As China's military and economic power grows, it raises questions about the region's power balance.
Hello, Assalamualaikum. So my name is EYLIN AQMA, and I'll be the next presenter, and I'll be explaining about the theory of Spratly Island, which is realism. So basically, realism is a theory that claims to explain the reality of international politics. It emphasizes the constraints on politics that result from humankind's egoistic natures and the absence of a central authority above the state. The situation was complicated as both of these countries were unwilling to change their positions on the issues resolving the Spratly Islands. This attitude illustrates the arguments of the theory of political realism in international relations, where countries seek and formulate foreign policy with the nature of putting forward their own interests. At the moment, the resolutions of the conflict over the Spratly Islands look gloom unless a mutually beneficial bilateral agreement between the two countries can be effected. As a theory of political philosophy, the theory of political realisms, which is explain political relations with the assumptions that the primary end of any political actions is power holding through either for domestics or international arena. At the international scenes, it ought to be that nations are primary agents which strive to maximize their powers. In this regards, nations and politicians ought to pursue power for their interests. The theory then assumes that political interests have to be maintained through the exercise of power, and characteristically, every country of the world operates through competing power bases. In essence, realism is concerned with power rather than morality or material interests, by Mogento, 1984. Advocated his strong assumptions about human natures that humans are not naturally good and conflict is the natural outcome of the search for powers, not of misunderstanding. Ultimately, the theory of political realisms, as quoted in Williams, assumes that any country is necessarily self-seeking and formulates foreign policy from which it can realize gain and by its very natures can never set aside its own interests.
Thank you, Fazlin, for the explanation. By the way, I'm SHALEENA and I will explain about factor. Factor of Spratly Island become one of the traditional security threat towards Southeast Asia regional area. Firstly, the Spratly Islands are claimed by multiple countries as mentioned before: China, Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan and Malaysia. These overlapping claims have led to territorial dispute and tensions between these countries, which have escalated into military standoff and even armed conflict in the past. This has created a sense of insecurity and instability in the region, as any conflict in the Spratly Island could potentially spill over into neighboring countries. Secondly, the Spratly Islands are strategically located in the South China Sea, which is a vital shipping lane for global trade. The islands are also believed to be rich in natural resources, including oil and gas reserves, which have attracted the interest of many countries. This has led to increased competition and tension between countries as they seek to assert their claim and protect their interests in the region. Finally, the militarization of the Spratly Island by some countries, particularly China, has raised concern among other countries in the region. China has built military installations on several of the islands, including airstrip, missile system, which has led to fear that it's seeking to establish a military presence in the region and project its power beyond its borders. Next, the advantages is resources-rich area. The Spratly Islands are believed to have significant oil and gas reserves, as well as valuable fishing grounds. The country involved in the dispute could potentially benefit from the exploitation of these resources. The other advantages is strategical location. The Spratly Islands are located in a strategic location in the South China Sea, which is a major shipping route for international trade. Control over the island could provide a strategic advantage for the countries involved. Moving for the disadvantages is tension and conflict. The territorial dispute have led to tension and conflict between the countries involved, which could potentially escalate into a larger conflict. This could have negative consequences for the region and the world as a whole. Lastly, the disadvantages is environmental damage. The dispute has led to increase the military activity in the region, which could have negative environmental consequences. The construction of military base and other infrastructure could damage the fragile ecosystem of the island and surrounding waters.
So next, we will be moved to the suggestions. The first suggestion to resolve the Spratly Islands conflict is by having multilateral diplomatic initiative. These solutions is to prevent any disputes and having safe shipping water between the 6 claimants' arbitrations between the Philippines and China that have failed due to the China refuse to give consent toward the arbitrations. Even if China participated in the arbitrations, recognizing its jurisdictions, a bilateral settlement would not address the multilateral dispute dispute over the Spratly Islands. Due to many countries involved with this conflict, the International Court of Justice found it is quite difficult to reach an agreement. Since the ICJ's conflict procedures is well defined and rigid, it takes a long time to settle any international disputes in the Court of Justice. None of the means of settlements prescribed in Article 287 of the UNCLOS is likely to resolve these complex disputes. Except for Taiwan, the rest of the parties to the Spratly disputes are the UN members and thus de facto members of the ICJs. China is still in a position to refuse or block any resolutions declared by the ICJ, according to its wishes, by using its veto powers as a permanent member of the Security Council. Then, the second suggestion to resolve Spratly Island is by the International Joint Commission strategies. The creation of an International Joint Commission of an appropriate number of representatives of each of the parties to the conflict could be an efficient way settling Spratly's disputes. The participation of equal delegates of each of the 6 claimants means that an International Joint Committee will be set up to reach an unanimous agreement on the mode of resolutions. In the case of Spratly Island, though, the main challenge may be the information of a joint commission with the involvement of 6 claimants, as not all the parties have authorities over the whole Spratly Islands. Then, the third suggestion is Mutual Development Scheme, which is the other option proposed in 2009 was to implement joint resource development by declaring the Southern China Sea to be a semi-enclosed zone. That's all for me. Thank you.
Last but not least is the conclusion. To recapitulate, territorial disputes have always been a long and exhausting battle as a fight that has traditional traits. The Spratly Island conflict is an example of interest in which 6 countries compete to control the small group of islands in the South China Sea slowly because they are rich in natural resources and strategically located in the middle of trade routes.
The South China Sea, a region of tremendous economic and geostrategic importance. Below the seabed, you find massive oil and natural gas reserves worth trillions. In the waters, you find vast marine life that is crucial to the food security of millions of Southeast Asians. On the surface, you find 1/3 of the world's maritime shipping industry passing through the waters, carrying over $3 trillion in trade each and every single year. And if you put all of that together, you start to understand why the South China Sea is so important. This is why it's heavily contested by multiple nations. But as with anything in life, some just don't play by the rules. Since 2013, China has been trying to claim almost 90% of the South China Sea. China argues it has historic rights over this territory because Chinese analysts and academics contend that the islands of the South China Sea were first discovered by China's Han Dynasty more than 2 millennia ago. This is how the infamous 9-9 came to be, that overlaps multiple countries' exclusive economic zones, including Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. This led to a fair amount of tension between China and these nations. But China knew it couldn't claim a territory they had no infrastructure or civilians on, so they started construction of man-made islands in the South China Sea in hopes of them being accepted as Chinese territory. Or at least that was what we thought they were doing, until satellite imagery revealed the alarming truth. China was building military bases on the islands equipped with airstrips and high-tech equipment such as anti-aircraft guns. It was clear that China was ready to do whatever it took to take control of the South China Sea. This would eventually lead to the Philippines bringing this to an international tribunal in The Hague that unsurprisingly ruled against China's claims to the sea. However, China promptly rejected the authority of the tribunal and its findings in the case, which led to China continuing its operations in the South China Sea. This is the reason why China still to this day has a strong presence in the area. But recent events have indicated that China's presence in the area might soon be over. Not only is China's biggest enemy, the United States, beginning to strengthen its presence in the region through countless freedom of navigation operations, but Vietnam, the country that opposes China's claims the most, has quietly been building up 10 artificial islands that all have a very specific purpose. And recent reports have stated that China might have sabotaged itself through poor building practices, as the concrete that keeps China's islands from sinking is cracking. So let's find out what all of this means for China and the future of the South China Sea by first understanding the United States' growing interest to perform freedom of navigation operations, also known as FONOPs, in the area. Freedom of navigation operations are operations performed by the United States Naval and Air Forces to reinforce internationally recognized rights and freedoms by challenging excessive maritime claims. The particulars of each operation vary depending on the maritime claim that is being protested. But in the case of China's claims in the South China Sea, the United States has sent multiple warships well into the exclusive economic zone of China's man-made islands. This, along with information found in a Chinese magazine published by the company that builds China's Navy ships, has revealed the weaknesses of these islands. And they've found 4 crucial aspects in which these islands are vulnerable to attacks. First is the location of the islands. And by looking at this map, you can see they lie a fair distance away from mainland China. The distance means that China's fastest combat support ships would need more than 20 hours to reach the islands. The islands are also too far away to deploy the J-16, China's most advanced multi-role strike fighter. The fighters simply can't patrol the area because of the distance between the military bases on mainland China and on the islands. Furthermore, the islands only have one runway and therefore do not have the space to provide the facilities needed to support more than one aircraft at a time. This means that in the event of a conflict, a plane unloading or refueling on the islands would have to stay on the runway at all times, preventing other aircraft from using it. So, if we add up all of these weaknesses together, it's clear that China's man-made islands won't be able to stand up against an attack from another nation, although China is probably aware of this. And while it is true that these islands would be easy to attack, China may rely on the fact that any attack against any base in the South China Sea, even an outpost considered illegal under international law, would be considered an act of war against a nuclear power with vast military resources. The threat of retaliation alone may be sufficient to prevent the islands from facing any attack. And let's not forget that China isn't the only country with vulnerable bases far from its mainland that could be taken out by early strikes. Examples of this is the United States island of Guam and the Japanese island of Okinawa, where major US air bases are located. These are both within range of Chinese missile attacks, something China has reminded the United States of in the past. This is why a direct attack on the islands is highly unlikely. But what about an attack from nature? Well, the airstrips located on these islands are very close to the ocean, which leaves them exposed to damage from tides and tropical weather. However, this might not even be their biggest concern, as their artificial islands probably don't need external forces to sink, at least if you are to believe recent rumors claiming the concrete used in the foundation of these islands is cracking and turning to sponge, which, if it turns out to be true, China might have to leave the islands for good, leaving the South China Sea to be claimed by opposing nations. This is where Vietnam comes into the picture, as they have quietly been building up 10 artificial islands without the world noticing. And since 2017, Vietnam has slowly added buildings to some of these islands. The goal is to make these islands self-sustaining, which would make it incredibly difficult for China to take them. Vietnam has also shown on multiple occasions that they are not afraid to bump shoulders with Chinese vessels, if necessary. This has forced China to leave Vietnam alone, as any further actions could lead to a nuclear war. Although the Vietnamese government has made it very clear they have no other intentions with their man-made islands than to defend themselves. This explains why they have put solar panels on the islands and are trying to grow crops as well. But let's try and zoom out a bit, as this looks just like a massive game of chess, where a single wrong move could mean the destruction of multiple nations. And reality is that every single nation is aware of this, which is why they get as close to the line as possible without ever crossing it. But even if we will never see a war in the South China Sea, it seems there are only 2 possible outcomes. Either China surrenders, or we will have an everlasting chess game in the South China Sea. And while China might not want to surrender, it might have to because of nature. You see, as I mentioned earlier in the video, These islands have no defense against nature, because if the rumors of cracking concrete are true, a typhoon could easily sink the islands as there would be no structural support to keep them afloat. And considering typhoons can occur up to twice a month in the South China Sea, it's only a matter of time before China's islands will be hit. But until that day comes, the South China Sea dispute will most likely continue, as China has no benefit in surrendering.